how can we better leverage the tools that we have available to change and shape behavior in a manner that's going to enable society to be more productive? And this is what I observed about psychedelic when I was in college at Stanford University. These drugs have been designated by society as being too risky for general use, and yet millions of people are using them every day. And from a legal perspective, those constraints were placed internationally in the 1970s. So since the 1970s, these drugs have been set aside as being too risky, hard to control.
When you take psychedelics, there's this idea of neuroplasticity and neuroelasticity. What actually happens to your brain?
So we can look at this at two levels. The first level is what happens kind of on the more like micro level. So just on the level of a neuron, what is plasticity? And then also we can look at this at a circuit level or across regions of the brain.
It's arguably you've got, way more safety data on some of these psychedelics, even if it's not organized and it's not in, a double-blinded placebo part study. But in many cases, if not hundreds for thousands of years, psychedelics have been used.
In terms of the Vietnam War, the need to fund a very expensive thing, which is war, which then generates a lot of profit from this production and sales of weapons, has a global effect, right? So the lobby structures, exists within that broader context of a government that needs to curry popular opinion in order to fund a very expensive endeavor. And guess what? We're right back there. And guess what's on the agenda again is psychedelics.
All right, we're rolling. Dr. Berra,
Great.
welcome.
Hi, it's
Thank you
great
for
to be
being
here.
Yeah, very good to have you here. Before we kick things off, I'd love for you to give a bit of overview on yourself, some of the work you're doing, and for the listeners, the context of today's episode is psychedelics and history, research, ongoing clinical trials, and hopefully the future.
Awesome. Yeah, so my name is Berra Yazar-Klosinski. I have a PhD in molecular cell and developmental biology and also a certificate in bioinformatics. So I thrive at the intersection of humans and technology, and I think of psychedelics as a form of technology. And they, originated in the natural world and enabled kind of the evolution of humanity through biological ways of shaping consciousness and our bodies and our societies. So that's really what I love to study as a biologist. I'm a systems biologist. So I like to look at how systems learn and grow.
Excellent. And what about psychedelics interested you? Give us a bit of color about, when did you get into psychedelics research to begin with? Because you've obviously been working in this space for some time, both in a, chairing capacity in certain nonprofit roles, as well as your own research, of course, and a number of your own initiatives and the work you're doing on the commercialization side as well. So what got you into this?
Yeah, so I first got interested in psychedelics when I was in college, and I understood from real-world observations that psychedelics had the capacity to really change behavior in humans. And that in and of itself is very difficult to do. Most of the sources of human suffering are attributed to the inability to change behavior. We can name a couple examples like, substance use disorders, really hard to change that behavior. Learning how to function as a society, learning how to have a functional government, really hard to change these behaviors, right? And so how can we better leverage the tools that we have available to us to change and shape behavior in a manner that's going to enable society to be more productive. And this is what I observed about psychedelic when I was in college at Stanford University. Uh, so fast forward to grad school years where I was working on my PhD, and I focused on really hardcore biology, looking at how do you make RNA from DNA and how do you control the rate of that process. And I didn't realize that ultimately psychedelics were going to lead me back to that, but then from that study of epigenetics and how you make really basic building blocks of physiology, I jumped over into clinical trials of psychedelics right after I completed my study on my PhD. So then I started getting really interested in the mechanism of how do psychedelics work? How can they change behavior? How do they do this in the brain, in the body? How do they change biology in order to affect behavioral change? So I worked on nonprofit-sponsored clinical trials of MDMA-assisted therapy, ibogaine for treatment of opioid use disorder, LSD-assisted psychotherapy, cannabis for treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. All of these are, the thing that these drugs have in common is that they're controlled substances. They have been designated by society as being too risky for general use, and yet millions of people are using them every day. And from a legal perspective, those constraints were placed internationally in the 1970s. So since the 1970s, these drugs have been set aside as being too risky, hard to control. Let's just forget about these powerful
Yeah.
substances.
Yeah.
um,
It's crazy. Have
yeah.
you seen this article? I think it's called "What Happened in 1971." I'm not sure if you've come across this.
I have not come across it, but I have a pretty good sense of what might be
Yeah,
mentioned. So you want to brief me on it?
I mean, I think it's sort of in the aftermath of, so it's on the basis of the conspiracy theory that the Manson family was actually planted by the U.S. government to disrupt the hippie movement, as it were, of the 60s. And with the government coming into the 70s and obviously rescheduling psychedelics and pretty much stopping all this psychedelic research, because the U.S. had history of psychedelic research until that point. Um, and you see essentially from the 70s this branch diverge almost economically, where in a normal economy, um, you pretty much get essentially the value that you create. So if you're getting X salary, it means roughly you're creating X-ish value in a perfect market. And now we've gone into a K-shaped economy since the 70s, and there's almost a theory that a number of these, whether it's social cultural changes or changes to the way we look at stress or anxiety or depression or trauma, a lot of that is rooted in what happened in 1971.
Yeah.
So I find that quite interesting. But you hit a point that I wanna unpack amongst other things that we talk about today, and that is, you said it's very hard to change things. I want to touch upon, I suppose, for people who have no idea around neural pathways and how the brain operates. Why is it hard to change things?
Yeah. Uh, it's hard to change behavior because we all get programmed during our childhood and during our development as we move from being children into adulthood. Uh, in the context of these highly sensitive periods in our neurobiology that are called critical periods. And there's a series of critical periods starting from, pretty much soon after birth, where, there's a critical period for your immune system where, everybody starts with a certain degree of innate immunity. And then they go through a critical period where their body learns from the environment. They get, a series of vaccinations during that time, during early childhood, in order to prime the immune system to be able to detect threat in the environment and be able to appropriately respond to it. Uh, and Similarly, during the development of the visual system, we go from in the womb not having visual inputs to getting visual inputs after birth, and then that visual system goes through a critical period. And once a critical period concludes, then most of the inputs that are relevant from the environment have been gained and processed. And from that point onward, you don't want to change your neurobiology too much, because then there's too many open possibilities that could lead to unanticipated consequences, because the environment is going to continue to throw different things at you, and if you don't have a way of like making a procedure for how you're
Hmm.
going to respond each time, it leaves too
Yeah.
much room for uncertainty and risk.
So the fear of the unknown almost makes us, I suppose, stick to these pathways that our brain understands is safe
Yeah.
in a sense. Um,
Yeah.
what is what does happen to your brain on psychedelics? I mean, when you take psychedelics, there's this idea of um, neuroplasticity and neuroelasticity. What actually happens to your brain?
So we can look at this at two levels. The first level is what happens kind of on the more like micro level. So just on the level of a neuron, um, what is plasticity? And then also we can look at this at a circuit level or across regions of the brain. So I'll start with the micro. At the micro level, neurons are transmitting electrical signals from one neuron to the next, and they are supported by these kind of supportive cast of cells called glia. And the supportive cast makes sure that those neurons have the necessary amount of energy in order to be able to, um, you know, get nutrients from the body and process the signals and make sure that everything is transmitted. Uh, there's a large amount of energy that gets processed in the brain. And the other area that is a major source of energy processing is the cardiovascular system. So
Yeah.
the metabolism of the body is, constantly feeding resources into these two areas. Uh, with neuroplasticity, the idea is that it's not just synaptic level plasticity with psychedelics that
Mhm.
is opened. It's that psychedelics are thought to function as a master key for reopening critical periods. And those critical periods are kind of what we talked about in development. They After a critical period closes in development, the behavior gets locked in, the signals get locked in, and there's these protective structures around the neurons called perineuronal nets that form in order to kind of calcify things or support the neurons in a really structured way. So that means that the perineuronal nets need to get broken down in order for a critical period to reopen. And then the neurons can make new connections, and they send out these little finger looking like projections called dendrites or neurites, and they reach out to other neurons and make connections. So at the
Excellent.
circuit level,
Yeah.
what is happening is that um, there's certain regions of the brain that typically communicate with other regions of the brain. So I'll give an example, like your hippocampus, which is where your memories are stored, processed and stored, or thought to be stored. We don't actually know where memories are exactly stored. That's another point to make. Um, your hippocampus is often communicating with your amygdala, which is kind of like the part of your brain that handles fight or flight responses and
Hmm.
reactivity to
Yep.
stress in the environment and internally. And so, in the context of psychedelics, what we find is that um, other regions of the brain will start to get into the communication flow, and
Mm.
these
Yep.
typical communication routes between set regions are now getting inputs from other regions, which then leads to um, more loosening and flexibility, cognitive flexibility uh, across brain regions.
Yeah. Is that so? I suppose a couple of questions on that then. If there is more interconnectivity within the regions of the brain, are some of these regions otherwise dormant to be activated when you've taken psychedelics, or are they independently operating but not connecting?
They're independently operating, but not really connecting. Yeah.
Got it.
Um,
And yeah, and
there's
then
also
when you
something worth mentioning, which is
yeah.
I mentioned energy, and
Hmm.
so the cells, such as neurons, have little organelles called mitochondria in them that are best known for generating energy, and those mitochondria may be a way that these regions are better communicating, even in the absence of like making a new neuronal connection, because mitochondria have the ability to network with one another and kind of do rapid communication um, across more disparate regions.
Yeah, and you mentioned that your brain almost unlocks these critical periods when you have taken psychedelics, and a popular notion amongst people who take psychedelics is the idea of an ego death. Um, is that what that is scientifically?
Uh, yeah, it may be connective. I think that there's uh you know parts of the brain what um people perceive as ego is the
Hmm.
self, right? So
Yeah.
there's a filter in our brains that helps us to distinguish self from non-self, and that filter is thought to reside in kind of um the signals that are generated across a certain network of brain regions. Some people call this the default mode network, um, although I think that is just a kind of a matter of semantics. Like, there's typical parts of the brain that impose this filtering uh, across when they're signaling across the relevant uh, so I think that sense of ego dissolution is that that filter is no longer being applied so strongly. And as a result, people are temporarily losing their sense of self and experience more oneness with the environment or within different parts of themselves.
Yeah.
Hi there. Thanks for tuning in. Welcome to OnRamp, a show about founders, innovators, researchers, and disruptors. My name is Ali Khani, and on this show, I'm going to be talking to people from all walks of life. I've spent most of my professional career in investment banking, helping raise millions of dollars for businesses shaping Australia's future. This has exposed me to a number of amazing people and has given me one really important thing: perspective. And that is what I'd like to share with you. Perspective that behind every breakthrough is a story, is a journey of missteps and turning points. So if you like the work that we're doing here, come and join us on that journey. Give us your support and help us further the mission. This is OnRamp.
I've often heard that psychedelics can create lasting and in many cases profound effects after short periods of exposure. And oftentimes you'll hear people that were suffering from a form of addiction or suffering from PTSD or long-term stress actually seeing results that last in many cases for years, if not months, after only a few sessions. Why do you think psychedelics have such a potent effect on the brain?
Yeah. I think that it boils down to these critical periods and how they once those critical periods are reopened and the structures that typically reinforce set behavior patterns are dissolved,
Yeah.
there's a newfound period of learning from the environment, and during that period, people are sensitive. So if they are in an environment that is, conducive to self improvement and conducive uh, to like a healing process, it can be very beneficial.
Hmm.
If during that sensitive period, where people can be vulnerable to external inputs, if they are in an environment that's not good for them, like a highly stressful environment, or they get in a traffic accident, then that could become the newly learned behavior pattern that can reinforce fear. So
Yeah.
it is
Okay.
really critical to be mindful of that sensitive period, and also not to um, do psychedelics too often, because the more that these critical periods are reopened over and over and over, like, it can really affect people's
Yeah.
sense of
The more
self
vulnerable
and
you
how,
are.
yeah, they become more vulnerable. So it
Yeah.
is important to have the risks in mind.
And these critical periods, are they typically in, let's say, the first, 3 to 5 years of your life? Or would it be sort of,
There are
later?
different critical periods. There's also in adolescence, there's a social reward critical period. That's actually the first one that was identified with
Right.
psychedelics, was the social
Hmm.
reward critical period. But there are other ones that are earlier in life, and I think that it's like around age 12 or something.
Right. Okay. All
The
right. That's
social
much later
reward
than I
one.
thought, actually.
Yeah.
I want to talk a bit on the origins of psychedelics. I think that, um, you obviously are from a world of clinical research. One of the major themes is understanding safety and toxicology. Um, and it's arguably you've got, way more safety data on some of these psychedelics, even if it's not organized and it's not in, a double-blinded placebo part study. But in many cases, if not hundreds for thousands of years, um, psychedelics have been used. If you look at, for example, the culture that I come from, I'm originally from India, or even in South American cultures. I have a few friends who um, are from South America and speak, very highly of um, some of the substances as well. Why do you think, history has, in a sense, been so unkind when, if you could turn the clock back, psychedelics were, not just accepted, but even encouraged as a rite of passage?
Yeah. Yeah, I think this boils down to a couple factors. So one is what type of information and data is considered sufficient for being considered evidence-based and for supporting regulatory decision making. Two, a lot of the thousands of years of experience with certain molecules is not written down in terms of the data that it generated. It's a lot of it is verbally described and passed down. And historically speaking, um, with a lot of indigenous cultures, their traditions and their stories were actually not written and passed down. They were verbally transmitted from generation to generation. So now there's all these really cool projects that are aimed at documenting indigenous knowledge in the format of video, for example,
Yeah.
which is easier to capture, or audio, which is easier to capture in an indigenous tradition. But it's really challenging to capture that in writing sometimes, right? And so
Yeah.
in order for data to support regulatory decision making, the first tenet is that it has to be in written or numeric format. Um, and, um, we've gone through a, in the early 1900s, which is when FDA was originally formed,
Hmm. Yeah.
there was a transition where, like, certain uh, medications were kind of grandfathered in and into clinical practice, and other medications were excluded at that point in time when FDA was formed. And FDA's whole mandate was to ensure that any drug or medication that's marketed has reasonable data to support its safety and effectiveness, because
Yeah.
this goes back to the time of, like, quack doctors, where people would, like, have some liquid in a bottle and make
Yeah.
all sorts of promises that it was going to help you with everything, right? So
There was
that's the
also
whole.
cocaine and Coca-Cola back then. So
There was, yes, there was, and there was also lithium in Sprite, which turns out was a great idea. We should have not taken it out. Um, so, um, so yeah, that was a period where at least in the United States, the health system moved from kind of a more holistic approach that included plant medicines as well as synthetic medicines, and moved really strongly towards chemicals that are, require some degree of petroleum products in order to be produced. And the homeopathy and herbal medicines were categorically removed from the United States Pharmacopoeia at that time. So
this is a really interesting point you're making right here.
I agree. Yeah, I was just really digging into this the other day, and so, and there's a lot of potential incentive structures that were the basis for this change that we could speculate about. But also there was a really strong emphasis on the importance of data in making decisions. Now, it's interesting though that with psychedelics, there was a categorical exclusion of available data when they were placed into suppressed substance scheduling. And in those cases, the data that was available, that was written down, was deemed not good enough and hence ignored. And I think we're going to keep seeing that over and over in reality, is that certain data are just not considered good enough by...
Why? Is that because they're not hard endpoints?
So in psychiatry in general, there aren't hard endpoints. Endpoints are very typically considered, clinical interview that is then converted from a kind of a mixed methods approach. So qualitative information gets turned into quantitative information that then generates a score on which you can do statistics. But in other disciplines outside of psychiatry, there's, blood pressure changes, for example, they start out quantitative. They don't start out qualitative. And so those are an example of harder endpoints. The other thing that's a really, important hard endpoint is mortality, morbidity. And these are just hard to argue with in terms of the reality of them. So those types of data can be the basis for stronger arguments for an evidence base.
I want to touch upon the 1970s for a second there, about the incentive structures. How much, and I know this is one of those, how long the piece of string question, but how to what extent do you think the big pharma lobby came into the picture here? Because obviously Nixon comes into the 70s, comes in with this neoliberalistic government structure, and pretty much that's when the economy starts going K-shaped. So the rich get increasingly richer. I believe it was at the time in the 70s, and I might be wrong on this, so fact check it, but I think the top 1% controlled about 7 to 8% of US GDP, relative to the top 1% controlling 30% of US GDP today. And the bottom 50% have just gone completely down. And I think that a lot of that has to do with these lobby structures that were formed with big oil and big pharma. And obviously, I think that's impacted the economy. But within the context of psychedelics, what role do you think the lobbies have played?
Yeah, I think that the lobbies are it's hard to pin it onto the any sort of lobbying structure. I think there were much larger forces at play in terms of the Vietnam War and the need to fund a very expensive thing, which is war, which then generates a lot of profit from this production and sales of weapons, and also has a global effect, right? So the lobby structures, exists within that broader context of a government that needs to curry popular opinion in order to fund a very expensive endeavor. And guess what? We're right back there. And guess what's on the agenda again is psychedelics. Mm-hmm. So, in my mind, psychedelics come into the picture whenever people need to do something that will appeal to the public and their opinions in order to gain support for really expensive projects like wars.
Yeah, it's almost political currency in a sense.
Yeah.
And I think that, if there's any sort of significant commercialization leap to be made, it'll have to be data backed. Obviously. So I want to ask you then, when you look towards, the future, and you look at the biggest opportunity, I suppose, because on the one hand, I think there's an intersectionality here. We're seeing clinical trials, clinical development of drugs being disrupted in various manners, whether you're talking about AI or whether you're talking about regulatory changes. And then you've got a changing public sentiment towards psychedelics. What excites you the most about this area of research when you look at it, let's say, on a 5-year, 10-year timescale?
Yeah. I think that there's a lot to be learned from the real world use of psychedelics that I'm excited about being better able to leverage using AI enabled analytics. There's the potential to establish registries and generate more realistic and generalizable data about psychedelics that can then be the data would then be of sufficient quality to enable regulatory decision making and really shorten the typical timeline for drug development, which is about 20 years. Just to get from the point of toxicology studies in animals to an approved drug for marketing. And then subsequent to that, it has to be commercially launched. And then prescribers have to agree to prescribe it, right? So overall, we're looking at like a 25-year process. And then systematic literature reviews need to be published in order for clinical practice guidelines to change, which adds on another 10 years. So we're currently operating under a 35-year-old medical paradigm right now. And 9 years from now is not going to be enough time to move that needle, unfortunately, in 2035. What we need to do is really focus on speeding up that timeline and enabling clinical practice to change in a more data-informed manner on a faster time frame. That's the thing that excites me the most about psychedelics, because the magnitude of data available really enables us to do that much better than the previous.
It helped, obviously, if the EMA and FDA have outgoing chief, so
Yeah.
they can reclassify it also, like the TGA did.
It's true, but I think that Australia has a permissive regulatory environment that doesn't quite exist in the US.
It's interesting. I mean, you say there's, and it's about 35 years, but it's also, from a monetary standpoint, I believe it's on an average between $200 to $300 million to take a drug to market, roughly.
Yeah.
And it's
not enough for a drug to get to market. The drug also has to be profitable in the market in order for it. And it can't be too profitable because then the insurance companies don't cover it. It has to be just right profitable, such that it's a reasonable investment that's like somewhat de-risked and can gain investment.
Yeah, you don't want this becoming another insulin case study in the United States, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or GLP-1,
So
another prime example.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, which is it's crazy, and I'm thinking about also again looking at, for example, another area that I'm quite interested in separate to this is peptides at the moment. I think there's a lot of work happening in the space. There's also a pretty interesting intellectual property position around peptides that I'm interested in exploring, because they aren't as straightforward to commercialize, and therefore, don't get as much traction from, I suppose, the commercial pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, I actually think that conducting these same, like taking the template of what we just described with psychedelics and applying it to peptides, there's a lot of corollaries. In the US, now there's openness to considering reclassification of peptides on the side of the the regulators, largely pushed due to political reasons. Uh, However, I think it presents an opportunity to try a new way of drug development, which still generates necessary data to understand risk benefit, but doesn't require all these onerous animal studies that have dubious applicability to humans and also happen to kill a lot of animals, which I am not happy about.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, decades of drug development before somebody decides to trust the data and change their prescribing practices on that basis.
Yeah. Excellent. Dr. Berra, this show is called On Ramp, and the reason it's called On Ramp is because it's a on ramp to a knowledge highway for me, and I get to meet cool people like you and ask my 20 questions.
Yeah.
And the question I always ask at the end of each show is, based on all the work that you're presently doing, what's the next on ramp that you're most excited about? What's that next highway, the next frontier that you want to reach?
Yeah. So my next on ramp is looking at how to optimize mental health treatments through optimizing the immune system, and there's a lot of reasons to consider that the neuroimmune mechanisms are kind of a key into more limited doses of drugs with better longer term outcomes.
Excellent. That does sound like a really interesting area of research, especially because of how increasingly immunocompromised we're getting as a population.
Exactly. And the immune
Yeah.
system is a key way that, first off, we started out talking about the critical period of the immune system. And it is what enables our physiology to be responsive to its environment. And when that interaction of human with environment goes astray, that's when we have health problems. So I think really moving towards holistic health and not just limiting to mental health, but and psychiatry, but looking at the connection of mind and body with better neuroimmune functioning is really where I'm passionate about.
Amazing. Well, thank you for the amazing work that you're doing, and thank you for coming on and telling us so much about it. I certainly learned a lot.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was great.